The idea to ride that old service road came to me when I was 24, behind my grandfather's place in eastern Tennessee. My uncle would talk about that hollow as if it were an indelible mark on our family's past. Leaning back in his chair, picking at his beer label, he'd mention things like, "That hollow is older than any grave around here." He'd quickly change the subject, as if he'd almost revealed too much. I figured it was just superstition, a way to keep kids from wandering too deep into the woods and getting bitten by snakes or lost. I hadn't been back to that house for a long time, not since I was a teenager. After my grandfather passed, someone had to go clean out what remained. More was left than anyone expected. The place seemed to have sunk back into the hillside since his passing. Kudzu was consuming everything, climbing the porch, draping the gutters, forcing its way through window screens. The old satellite dish was bent in half under the weight of vines. Even the porch swing had collapsed as if it had simply given up. Inside was no better. Every room carried the mix of mildew, old newspaper, and the sourness of mouse droppings. It was a smell that clung to your hair and clothes, following you even after you left. I spent the whole day hauling out boxes, bundles of moth-eaten quilts, stacks of water-damaged magazines, jars of unlabeled contents sealed so long the stickers had peeled off. I kept telling myself I was making headway, but every corner I turned revealed more stuff crammed full. By dusk, my shoulders ached so badly they felt like lead pipes. I remember standing in the kitchen, staring at the counter and thinking how much quieter it was without him. That's when I saw the Polaris keys hanging from a crooked nail by the doorframe. Such an ordinary thing almost stunned me with memories. I used to ride that ATV all over the property, racing down trails while my grandfather watched from the porch rail, pretending not to look. He never said a word, just squinted at me, seeming to wait for me to do something foolish. Usually I did. I'm not sure what made me take it out that evening. Maybe it was the quiet closing in on me. Maybe I was trying to recapture the feeling of being a kid before the world got heavy. I didn't overthink it. I grabbed the keys, swung a leg over, and started the engine. I headed up the trail behind the barn. It was the same path I'd taken as a little kid. Back then, it felt endless, like it went all the way to the horizon. The first part was cracked pavement with grass at the edges, the fence sagging between posts. After about a mile, the pavement gave way to hard-packed clay. The ruts were deep enough to jar my spine every few yards. My teeth actually clicked together once, with a foolish thought that I might chip one. I passed the old hunting blind in the walnut tree, just a square of gray plywood nailed to the trunk. It looked worse than I remembered. The side panels hung in tatters, the ladder broken halfway up, splintered in a way that didn't look like rot, more like something heavy had rested on it. I slowed without meaning to. The hair on my arms stood up. I considered turning back, but didn't. Told myself it was nothing, just old wood and weather. I kept going another 15 minutes. The trail dipped into a wide clearing, a shallow depression ringed by black locust trees. 3 trailers sat there in a messy half-circle, looking like they'd been dumped decades ago and left to rust. They seemed like a place where nothing good ever happened, the kind you'd expect to find buzzards picking over something they shouldn't. Then I noticed the tire tracks. They were fresh, clearly defined. The dirt still held the imprint of the tread. I killed the engine and sat there for a second, listening to the quiet. It wasn't the normal quiet. There were no birds, no insects, just a hollow stillness that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I dismounted. My boot sank into the damp ground. Each step felt unnaturally long, like I was moving through something thicker than air. When I reached the nearest trailer, I had to steady myself on the doorway. My legs felt unsteady. Inside, the floor was buried in old leaves and scraps of stained carpet. In the far corner, a pile of bones, small ones, maybe dog, maybe deer, picked clean and arranged in careful rows, as if whoever made them wanted them ordered just so. I turned to leave, and that's when I saw the twine strung across the doorway. Little gray shapes dangled from it, clacking gently in a breeze I couldn't feel. I leaned closer, squinting. For a moment, I thought they were rocks. Then I realized they were skulls. each one pierced and threaded like beads. My throat tightened. I stumbled backward, almost tripping over broken concrete. My heart hammered so hard, I thought it would choke me. I should have left right then, climbed back on the ATV and gotten out, but a part of me needed to follow those tracks. Not curiosity, exactly. More like a dull, stubborn need to finish it. Like if I stopped halfway, I'd never be able to forget. So, I followed the trail past the trailers. The path narrowed into switchbacks winding down through the trees. Occasionally, boards nailed to trees showed strange symbols I didn't recognize. Circles slashed with lines, spirals around stick figures. Some looked drawn with something brown that flaked away in the wind. I tried not to dwell on them. I don't know how long I walked. Maybe 20 minutes, maybe an hour. It felt like the sun was setting faster than it should, like time itself was trying to hurry me out. The trail leveled into a hollow so deep it was almost dark. A collapsed stone foundation sagged against the hillside. A doorway was sunk into the wall, a black hole big enough to walk through. I edged closer. The smell hit me about 6 feet away, a thick, sweet rot that stuck in the back of my throat. I gagged and held my shirt over my nose. I clicked on my flashlight and aimed the beam inside. In the far corner, a pile of burlap sacks shifted, just a slow, deliberate movement, like something inside was trying to roll over. I heard a scraping breath, low and wet. My knees went weak. For a second, I thought I'd fall face first into the doorway. I took one step back. Before I could take another, a hand clamped down on my shoulder. I froze. Every thought just vanished. When I turned, a man stood there. He wore a battered canvas hat pulled low. His beard was long. His mouth curved into this polite, humorless smile. "Don't go in there," he said, like giving directions. I couldn't move, couldn't answer. He raised a finger to his lips. "You don't belong here. Turn around." Still, I just stood there, locked in place. He leaned closer. His breath smelled like soil after rain. "Run." He let go, and whatever held me still just let go. I spun around and bolted up the trail. My legs were shaking so badly I almost fell twice. I didn't look back. I knew if I did, I'd see something I couldn't scrub out of my mind. I don't know how long it took to reach the clearing again. The trailers loomed in the dusk, empty windows staring. I scrambled onto the ATV, both hands shaking so badly I almost dropped the keys. When the engine finally caught, I turned it too hard and fishtailed in the dirt. I gunned it up the hill, not caring if I wrecked the suspension. I didn't slow down until the barn roof came into view between the trees. I parked by the porch and sat there gripping the handlebars. I tried to think of anything that could explain it. Every explanation sounded like something from a cheap horror novel. When the sun finally rose, I loaded the last of the stuff into the truck. I didn't call the sheriff, just slid the keys under a loose brick on the porch. Story 2, paraphrased. When I was 32, I decided to spend a full week alone in the most remote part of the Blue Valley Range I could reach without a guide. I'd camped many times before, lots of long weekends, a few week-long treks, but the idea of going completely off-grid kept nagging me, feeling like the only way I'd truly prove I could handle being completely alone. I couldn't quite put that feeling into words, but it settled in my chest and wouldn't leave me alone. I began planning a month ahead. Each evening after work, I'd spread new topographic maps across the kitchen table. I'd trace old forestry roads with my finger, looking for areas with no maintained trails. Nothing marked except an occasional stream or an elevation contour. One night, I even dug out an old pamphlet from years ago, picked up at a ranger station, with a faded cover photo of some cabin ruins and a heading like Unrecorded Hollows of the Blue Valley. The pages were warped, but there was enough detail to spark my interest. I wanted to leave nothing to chance. I bought a new tent advertised as waterproof, extra batteries, restocked my first aid kit, and added a small hand crank radio, mostly for peace of mind as a last resort if something went wrong. I even packed 3 different knives, which seems dramatic now, but at the time felt like the right amount of caution. Before I left, I called my brother Matt. I tried to sound casual, though I could tell he was skeptical, mentioning something about me starring in my own missing persons documentary. I laughed it off, though a small part of me wondered if he had a point. The morning I left, I woke before dawn. My old Subaru looked heavy under the weight of all my gear. The back was so packed I had to wedge my sleeping bag behind the passenger seat. As I drove, I kept picturing the trailhead, a welcoming entry point to adventure. When I finally pulled over onto Eastwick Trace, it was just a gravel scrape on the road shoulder. No sign, no marker, no helpful arrow. Just an opening in the trees that looked like a deer track no one had walked in decades. I almost turned around right then, but I'd spent too much time preparing to back out over a lack of signage. So, I shut off the engine, hauled my pack out of the back, and stood for a moment, listening to the quiet. Then, I started off. That first day went exactly as I'd hoped. The silence was almost a relief. I didn't see a single person. I covered 12 miles, perhaps more. The only signs of others were a crumbling chimney, standing alone in a clearing, and a line of rusted fence posts ending abruptly at the tree line. A couple of times, I had to step over thick tangles of vine that had completely overgrown the path, making it look like they were trying to erase it. Late in the afternoon, I reached the ridge I'd marked, noting simply good flat ground. I was right. About 100 yards west, the slope dropped into a hollow where a narrow stream ran over pale rocks. I set up my tent in this shallow natural bowl between 3 boulders. The spot felt hidden in a way that finally relaxed my shoulders after weeks of tension. I spent an hour gathering smooth stones from the creek to build a fire ring. When I finally lit the fire, I sat on my pack and just watched the flames. The quiet was different from anything I'd known before. No distant cars, no planes, not even other campers' voices echoing through the trees. Just the occasional snap of a branch dropping somewhere unseen. Dinner was a pouch of freeze-dried stew I'd been avoiding trying. It tasted like warm salt with some chewy lumps, but it was filling enough that I felt drowsy by the time the sky went dark. I jotted a few notes in my journal about the route and potential game trails. When I finally crawled into the tent, I rested a hand on the belt knife's handle. Not because I was scared, at least that's what I told myself, but because it had become a habit on solo trips, a little reassurance in the dark. The second morning, I woke to a thin layer of mist lying low across the ground. It was so pale, it made everything look dusted with flour. I brewed coffee that tasted like burnt plastic and walked slowly around the campsite to get my bearings. The ridge sloped down into a narrow gully that felt like an invitation. I kept telling myself I'd just look over the rise, but after lunch I decided to follow it properly. I picked my way down for almost a mile. The deeper I went, the more certain I became that no one had set foot there in decades. Fallen trees lay across the gully like barricades. I saw a length of rusted chain half buried in the leaves. A little farther on, I found a small pile of bones picked clean. They looked too small for anything but a raccoon or fox. I stood there listening for a while, but the gully was utterly still. On the way back, something caught my eye. A patch of fresh-looking dirt off the trail, mounded unevenly. At first I thought it might be a burrow, but the hole was too wide and shallow for any animal I knew. I felt a crawling unease in my neck, but I told myself it was just my imagination. I didn't go closer. That evening, I stayed by the fire longer than usual, feeding it stick after stick, watching the edges of the clearing. When the logs crumbled to embers, I finally crawled into the tent. My eyes burned from staring at the fire. I don't know exactly when I woke up. All I remember is the moon was bright enough to trace every branch and cast silhouettes on the nylon. For a moment I couldn't place where I was, or why my chest felt so tight. Then I heard it. A voice, low and close, saying my name. Not a shout, not a question, just spoken, steady, like whoever it was knew exactly where I lay. My throat closed up. I tried to swallow but couldn't. My ears rang so loudly I thought they'd drown out everything else. The voice didn't come again. Eventually I convinced myself it had to be a dream. I lay there, eyes wide open, until dawn began to creep through the trees. When the light finally came, I unzipped the tent in quick jerks, expecting to see footprints or some sign I wasn't alone. Nothing was amiss, no broken branches, no scuffs in the soil, just the same clearing I'd pitched my tent in. I spent the whole day trying to distract myself, collecting wood, fishing in the stream, sorting and resorting my gear. But as the light started to fade again, I felt this slow pressure in my chest, like the trees themselves were leaning closer. I couldn't shake the feeling that staying another night was a mistake. That evening, I made the fire larger than before. I gathered every dry branch I could find and fed the flames until they threw light halfway up the boulders behind me. I settled against a boulder with my knees drawn up, thinking if I stayed awake, maybe I'd feel in control. It was a nice theory. At some point, I must have drifted off. I woke to the embers fading to dull red, the cold seeping through my jacket. For a few seconds, I thought maybe the night would pass without incident. Then, behind the boulder, I heard breathing, slow, steady, deliberate, like whoever it was didn't care if I heard, as long as I didn't turn around. My hands started to tremble so badly, I almost dropped the flashlight. I sat there frozen, staring at the fire's last glow. My legs went numb from not moving. I couldn't bring myself to look over my shoulder. The breathing didn't change. It never sped up or slowed down, just stayed exactly the same until the first gray light filtered through the trees. When it finally stopped, I felt hollowed out. I stood up on legs that barely worked and broke camp in record time. My pack was a mess of straps and half-zipped pockets. I didn't care. I just needed to move. I hiked hard, barely pausing for water. Every time I glanced back, I was sure I'd see someone stepping into view. The trail felt narrower, like the trees were closing in. My breath came in uncontrollable gasps. About a mile from the trailhead, I stopped so fast my boot slipped on damp leaves. In the middle of the trail was a single boot print, larger than mine by at least 2 sizes, pressed deep into the soft earth. No other prints led up to it, none led away. I didn't take a picture, I didn't study it, I just started running. When I reached my car, I locked the doors before even setting my pack in the seat. My hands were shaking so badly I dropped the keys twice before getting them in the ignition. I didn't look back until I'd driven 10 miles, until the trees thinned into pasture land. That was the last time I ever camped alone. Story 3, paraphrased. That summer, I worked for a small conservation group in the southern Blue Ridge. It wasn't a glamorous job. Mostly it was just me, a clipboard, and a lot of sweat trying to identify different moss species I'd cataloged weeks before. The team was small, only 6 of us, and we took turns hauling gear, updating old surveys, and driving to places so remote you'd question why they were even on the official maps. The older folks called these areas forgotten tracks, which always sounded a bit dramatic to me. But after what happened, I think forgotten might have been too generous. I still remember the morning they assigned me track 14. It was the first Monday in June. We worked out of a converted ranger station with a tin roof that pinged constantly in the sun. My supervisor, Elena, gave me the file and said something like, "Good luck. This one's a black hole." She wasn't exaggerating. Half the papers were copies of copies, blurry and hard to read. The last field report from 1978 was basically just a list of trees and rough counts of native plants, with this single line tacked on at the end: "Old dwelling remains. Advise caution." That was all. No explanation, no follow-up. I figured maybe Brooks, the guy who wrote it, had just been spooked by a raccoon or a bear den. I wish that's all it was. I signed out a GPS unit, one of those clunky gray models that loses signal if you sneeze, and grabbed a fresh stack of survey sheets. Then, on my pack, and set out. The road out there was the worst I'd ever driven. The gravel thinned until it was just 2 ruts packed into clay. Weeds in the middle were taller than my bumper for stretches. It took me almost 2 hours to get past the last mailbox, and by then, my nerves were already frayed. Eventually, the road just stopped pretending to be a road. I pulled over where it dissolved into grass and broken branches. When I got out, everything fell silent in a way that felt wrong. I slowly turned, trying to spot a landmark, and finally saw a line of fence posts looking more like termite mounds than anything built by people. About 8 feet up a sycamore trunk was a warped board with a burned-in 14. That was my only confirmation I was in the right place. I thought it felt like the start of a bad joke, with the punchline waiting just past the trees. I slung my pack on, adjusted the compass clip on my pack strap, and stepped over a collapsed fence. Within maybe 20 steps, the road disappeared completely. The trees were massive, trunks thick like old silos, branches tangled high overhead where I couldn't see their tops. The first hour was a steady climb. I stopped often to scribble notes, patches of trillium, an occasional mushroom cluster, a tiny frog that almost hopped into my boot. My GPS kept flashing in and out, but by then I relied more on the compass. I was making my way along the ridgeside when I noticed a dip in the undergrowth, just a small indentation in the slope. I shifted position for a better view and saw the edge of a stone foundation tucked into a hollow. It looked so out of place that for a second I thought I was imagining it. I knew I should have just marked the spot and kept moving, but there was this feeling like the place was waiting specifically for me, like it had something it wanted to show. It sounds ridiculous, but that's how it felt. So I climbed down carefully, got a closer look. The foundation was a rectangle of stacked stones, partially collapsed in spots. Inside sat a rusty old stove, its pipe bent sideways as if wrenched by hand. Green moss grew in thick patches along the inside walls. I stepped over and started brushing leaves aside with my boot. Every little discovery felt like another piece of a story that didn't add up. Glass shards that might have been a window once, a spoon crushed almost flat, and a lunchbox so faded the cartoon animals were barely visible, some kind of bear family smiling under a sun. I crouched down and opened the latch. Inside was a wad of blue cloth tightly packed in a handful of marbles. The colors were still bright, swirls of red, yellow, and blue that looked almost fresh. That made the back of my neck prickle. I was crouched there, turning a marble over in my palm when I heard it. A slow, deliberate shift, like something heavy shifting its weight. I froze. My first thought was bear. My second thought was that no bear moves that quietly. I don't know what made me decide to explore that hollow that evening. Maybe it was the quiet pressing in. Maybe I was just trying to remember what it felt like to be a kid before things got complicated. I didn't overthink it. I just grabbed my pack, went down the slope, and started along the edge of the ridge. It was the same rough path I'd been on since I was a little kid. Back then, it felt endless, like it stretched all the way to the horizon. The first stretch was all cracked pavement, grass creeping in at the sides, the old fence drooping between posts. After about a mile, the pavement turned to hard-packed clay. The ruts were deep enough to jolt my spine every few yards. My teeth actually clicked together once, and I had this sudden, foolish thought I might chip one. I passed the old hunting blind up in a black walnut tree, just a square of gray plywood nailed to the trunk. I remembered it from when I was a kid, but it looked significantly worse. The side panels hung in tatters, and the ladder was broken halfway up, splintered in a way that didn't look like rot, more like something heavy had rested on it. I slowed down, though I didn't mean to. The hair on my arms prickled for a second. I thought about turning back, but I didn't. I told myself it was nothing, just old wood and too many seasons of rain. I kept going another 15 minutes. The trail dipped into a wide clearing, a shallow bowl in the earth ringed by black locust trees. 3 trailers sat there in a crooked half circle, looking like they'd been dragged there decades ago and left to rust. They seemed like a place where nothing good ever happened, the sort of place you'd expect to find buzzards picking over something they shouldn't. Then I noticed the tire tracks. They were fresh, clear as anything. The dirt was still soft where the tread had pressed in. I killed the engine and sat there for a second, listening to the quiet. It wasn't the normal quiet. No birds, no insects, just a hollow stillness that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I sat there for a moment, then started the ATV and headed back the way I came. My shoulders ached from hunching over, and by dusk, the clearing was almost swallowed in shadows. I was carrying the last box to the door when I heard it. Something heavy moving through the trees, a slow, deliberate crunch of branches underweight. I stopped so fast the box nearly slipped from my arms. For a few seconds, nothing happened. Then, the noise came again from the opposite side of the clearing. My mouth felt dry. I swallowed and set the box down carefully. My brain tried to be rational, probably just a deer, but every hair on my arms was standing up. Then I heard the tapping. It started low behind the cabin, 3 sharp taps like knuckles on wood. It paused, then tapped again. I felt my pulse hammering in my throat. I knew if I stepped off the porch to look, I'd regret it. So I didn't move. The tapping crept along the wall, inching toward the front corner. 3 beats. Pause. 3 beats again. My palms were slick. I shut the door and slid the bolt across. I turned off the lantern so no one could see in from outside. Then I crouched low, one hand braced against the floor, listening. The tapping stopped. A minute crawled by, then another. When the voice came, it sounded so close. I thought it was leaning against the wall. "You don't belong here." It was rough, like the words hurt to say. My breath went shallow. I pressed a hand over my mouth to keep from making a sound. Footsteps shifted outside, coming closer. "You should leave it," the voice rasped. I swallowed, forcing my chest to move. My voice sounded small and shaky. "I'm just here to pack my uncle's things." Nothing. No reply. The footsteps drifted away into the trees. I stayed crouched there, trying to decide if I'd rather sprint to the SUV or sit in that dark cabin all night. Neither option sounded good. I waited until the moon had climbed high enough to spill some light through the window. Hours passed without another sound. My legs were numb from crouching, but I didn't dare stand. Then, just when my brain started to convince me I'd imagined the whole thing, a single heavy thump hit the back wall. I flinched so hard, I almost dropped the lantern. Another thump came, then another, then a steady pounding that traveled around the cabin in a perfect circle. Each impact was measured, like fists keeping time. My hands shook as I relit the lantern. I walked to the door and pressed my ear against it. The pounding stopped. I cracked the door open. Nothing but the clearing and the trees. I nearly laughed in relief until I looked over at the wire. Every bone was gone. Just the sagging twine remained. That was all I needed. I bolted across the porch, my boots slipping on the boards. I didn't look back. I hit the SUV door with my shoulder, scrambled inside, locked everything, and jammed the key in the ignition. When the headlights swept over the trees, I saw them. Dozens of tall shapes standing at the tree line. They were perfectly still. I couldn't see faces, just the outlines of shoulders and heads. I stomped the gas. The SUV bounced over the ruts. In the rearview mirror, the clearing stayed empty, but my gut told me they wouldn't stay that way. It took me half the time to reach the main road. I didn't breathe easy until I pulled into a gas station in Darnell under the buzzing lights. I sat there gripping the wheel, sweat cooling on my neck, waiting for my hands to stop shaking. Story 4, paraphrased. That summer, I was working for a conservation group in the southern Blue Ridge. It wasn't a particularly glamorous position. Mostly it involved me, a clipboard, and a lot of perspiration trying to determine whether a patch of moss was the same species I'd already cataloged. The team was small, numbering 6 of us, and we cycled through responsibilities like hauling equipment, updating old surveys, and driving to locations so remote you questioned why they remained on official maps. The older members referred to these areas as forgotten tracks, a term that initially seemed overly dramatic to me. But after what occurred, I believe forgotten might have been too lenient. I still recall the morning I was assigned Track 14. It was the first Monday in June. Our base was a converted ranger station, its tin roof constantly pinging in the sunlight. My supervisor, Elena, handed me the file offering words like, "Good luck. This one's a black hole." She wasn't exaggerating. Much of the documentation consisted of copies, blurry and illegible. The final field report, dating back to 1978, amounted to little more than a list of trees and approximate counts of native plants, concluding with a single cryptic line, "Old dwelling remains. Advise caution." That was the extent of it. No explanation, no follow-up. I wondered if maybe Brooks, the author, had merely been startled by a raccoon or a bear den. I wish that's all it was. I checked out a GPS unit, one of those bulky gray models notorious for losing signal at the slightest provocation, and grabbed a fresh stack of survey forms. I loaded my pack and set off. The road leading there was the worst I had encountered. It transitioned from gravel to barely discernible ruts packed in clay. Weeds along the center often towered over my bumper. It took nearly 2 hours to clear the last mailbox, by which time my nerves were already on edge. Eventually, the road ceased pretending to be a road. I stopped where it faded into grass and broken branches. When I stepped out, an unnatural quiet fell. I slowly turned, searching for a landmark, and finally spotted a line of fence posts resembling more termite mounds than structures built by humans. About 8 feet up a sycamore trunk, a warped board bore a burned-in 14. That was my only confirmation of being in the correct location. I felt as though it were the setup for a bad joke, with the punchline lurking just beyond the trees. I shouldered my pack, adjusted the compass clip on my pack strap, and crossed a collapsed fence. Within perhaps 20 steps, the road disappeared entirely. The trees were immense, their trunks resembling old silos, branches interlaced high above where I couldn't see their tops. The first hour involved a steady climb. I stopped frequently to make notes. Patches of trillium, occasional clusters of mushrooms, a tiny frog that nearly leaped into my boot. My GPS signal kept flickering, so I relied more on the compass. I was traversing the ridge's slope when I noticed a depression in the undergrowth, just a slight indentation in the slope. I shifted my position for a better look and saw the edge of a stone foundation nestled in a hollow. It seemed so out of place that for a moment I thought I was mistaken. I knew I should have simply marked the spot and continued, but there was a sensation that the place was waiting specifically for me, as if it held something it wished to reveal. It sounds absurd, but that's the impression it gave. So I carefully climbed down, choosing my steps, and examined it closer. The foundation formed a rectangle of stacked stones, partially collapsed in places. Inside rested a rusty old stove, its pipe bent askew as if twisted by force. Green moss grew in thick patches along the inner walls. I stepped over and began brushing leaves aside with my boot. Each discovery felt like another piece of a narrative that didn't quite fit. Glass shards hinting at a former window. A spoon crushed nearly flat and a lunchbox so faded the cartoon animals were almost unrecognizable. A bare family smiling under a sun. I crouched down and opened the latch. Inside was a tightly wadded piece of blue cloth and a handful of marbles. The colors remained vivid. Swirls of red, yellow, and blue that seemed almost new. That made the back of my neck prickle. I was crouched there, turning a marble over in my palm when I heard it. A slow, deliberate shift, like something heavy shifting its weight. I froze. My first thought was bear. My second thought was that no bear moves that quietly. I don't know what prompted me to explore that hollow that evening. Maybe it was the quiet closing in. Maybe I was trying to recapture the feeling of being a child before the world felt heavy. I didn't dwell on it. I simply grabbed my pack, descended the slope, and began moving along the ridge. It was the same rough path I'd been on since I was a little kid. Back then, it felt endless, like it went all the way to the horizon. The first part was all cracked pavement, grass encroaching at the edges, the old fence posts leaning between them. After about a mile, the pavement gave way to hard-packed clay. The ruts were deep enough to jar my spine every few yards. My teeth actually clicked together once, and I had this sudden foolish thought I might chip one. I passed the old hunting blind in a black walnut tree, just a square of gray plywood nailed to the trunk. I remembered it from my childhood, but it looked significantly worse. The side panels hung in tatters, and the ladder was broken halfway up, splintered in a way that didn't look like rot, more like something heavy had rested on it. I slowed without intending to. The hair on my arm stood up for a second. I considered turning back but didn't. I told myself it was nothing, just old wood and too many seasons of rain. I continued for another 15 minutes. The trail dipped into a wide clearing, a shallow depression in the earth ringed by black locust trees. 3 trailers sat there in a messy half circle, looking like they had been dragged there decades ago and left to rust in place. They seemed like a place where nothing good ever happened, the kind of place you'd expect to find buzzards picking over something they shouldn't. Then I noticed the tire tracks. They were fresh, clearly defined. The dirt still held the imprint of the tread. I killed the engine and sat there for a moment, listening to the quiet. It wasn't the usual quiet. No birds, no insects, just a hollow stillness that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I sat there for a bit, then started the ATV and went back the way I came. My shoulders ached from stooping, and by dusk the clearing was almost swallowed in shadows. I was carrying the last box to the door when I heard it. Something heavy moving through the trees. A slow, deliberate crunch of branches underfoot. I stopped so abruptly, the box nearly slipped from my arms. For a few seconds, nothing happened. Then the noise came again from the opposite side of the clearing. My mouth felt dry. I swallowed and set the box down as quietly as I could. My brain tried to be logical, probably just a deer, but every hair on my arms was standing up. Then I heard the tapping. It started low behind the cabin, 3 sharp taps like knuckles on wood. It paused, then tapped again. I felt my pulse hammering in my throat. I knew if I stepped off the porch to look, I'd regret it. So I remained still. The tapping crept along the wall, inching toward the front corner. 3 beats. Pause. 3 beats again. My palms were slick. I shut the door and slid the bolt across. I turned off the lantern so no one could see in from outside. Then I crouched low, one hand braced against the floor, listening. The tapping stopped. A minute crawled by, then another. When the voice came, it sounded so close. I thought it was leaning against the wall. "Don't go in there," it said, like giving directions. I couldn't move, couldn't answer. He raised one finger to his lips. "You don't belong here. Turn around." Still, I just stood there, locked in place. He leaned closer. His breath smelled like soil after rain. "Run." He released me, and whatever held me still just let go. I spun around and bolted up the trail. My legs were shaking so badly I almost fell twice. I didn't look back. I knew if I did, I'd see something I couldn't scrub out of my mind. I don't know how long it took to reach the clearing again. The trailers loomed in the dusk, empty windows staring. I scrambled onto the ATV, both hands shaking so badly I almost dropped the keys. When the engine finally caught, I turned it too hard and fishtailed in the dirt. I gunned it up the hill, not caring if I wrecked the suspension. I didn't slow down until the barn roof came into view between the trees. I parked by the porch and sat there gripping the handlebars. I tried to think of any way to explain it. Every explanation sounded like something from a cheap horror novel. When the sun finally rose, I loaded the last of the stuff into the truck. I didn't call the sheriff, just slid the keys under a loose brick on the porch.